Flip, which is Mike's debut novel. It just came out. What was the publication?
August 16th.
August 16th. It's a story of a Midwesterner who gets wrapped up in all kinds of drama and intrigue in a startup company. And then Margaret's 2020 book, The Code, Silicon Valley, and the Remaking of America. Hooray. Similar theme, but it takes a true look behind the scenes at Silicon Valley and big tech. So I'm delighted to welcome them here for a conversation. We, of course, have both books for sale, so please buy them. We also have a lot of other books for sale, and so please do a little bit of shopping afterwards. As you may know already, there's wine, there's beer, there's non-alcoholic drinks, so please help yourselves. I think I'm going to turn it over to our special guest. Thank you so much for being here, and please join me in welcoming Margaret O'Mara.
First of all, thank you so much, Frida, and thank you for the whole staff of Bookends Beginnings, independent bookstores. Make the world go round and buy lots of books, y'all. Buy our books, but also yes. So
all your holiday shopping right here.
Right here, right now. So I'm Margaret O'Mara. I am, and I'm here with my classmate of the class of 1992, Mike Trigg, and this is so much fun. And we're going to be talking about a world that did not exist when the class of 1992 graduated from Northwestern. The internet was just commercializing. We were 1 year away from the Mosaic browser that became commercialized as Netscape and opened up the World Wide Web to the world. Mark Zuckerberg was 7. Yeah. Larry Page and Sergey Brin were computer science grads. No, they weren't even grad students. They were still in college. They're younger than us. And they were about to go to Stanford for grad school and then drop out and found Google. Amazon was 2 years away from existing. Jeff Bezos was still working on Wall Street, looking at the internet and thinking, oh, I should sell something on that. And here we are in 2022, and we are now in a world where the products and platforms of particularly 5 large American tech companies based in our 2 towns are kind of unavoidable parts of everyday life. Even if you decided that I'm going to be I'm going to delete everything, I'm going to try and live a life as free of tech as possible. If you are buying a book at Bookends and Beginnings, which you will tonight, that transaction might be backed by Microsoft Cloud Services or Amazon Web Services. Like the big 5 are hard to avoid.
Yes.
So we wanted to start by talking about why the 2 of us have decided to write about this crazy world. And I'm a historian. I wrote about the history of what actually happened. And Mike, you took on, I think, what's even to me, a very daunting challenge of, after having worked in tech, you turned around and wrote a novel about that world. So why'd you do it? Why'd you write BitFlip?
Great question.
To do this, for this event.
Well, it's funny. We were both history majors.
Yes.
In fact, I remember taking classes together, and I wrote a bunch of randomly history into the first version of this book about Silicon Valley. There was this whole backstory about a family that lived in the same house as the protagonist before he moved in, and it was completely irrelevant. It ended up being cut entirely from the book. The reason I wrote it is that there is so much great nonfiction about Silicon Valley. There's a ton of media coverage about Silicon Valley, but I didn't really read any fiction about Silicon Valley that I felt was authentic to the experience that I had. And so I went out to Berkeley I went out to California to go to UC Berkeley for business school and spent 20 plus years in the tech industry. And I think I sort of summarized what I felt was missing from the narrative was that so many stories about the tech sector and the people of the tech sector kind of portrayed them as heroes or villains, glorified them or vilified them. And for several people, like Mark Zuckerberg and the others you mentioned, they've kind of gone through both cycles. They've been glorified and then vilified. And my take was that it's more complicated than that. that there's a lot of shades of gray, and I wanted to tell that story and sort of show through the narrative how kind of everybody in Silicon Valley is in some ways complicit with both the good and the bad that industry has brought. The externalities that we didn't think existed at first. You know, when I moved to Silicon Valley, it was all gain, no pain. It was, you know, we're making the world a better place and we're gonna make shitloads of money. There was no, you know, we're not like those Wall Street people who are, you know, terrible, or big oil or big pharma or whatever. And now it's really become, I think, apparent what some of those negative consequences are. So that's why I wrote my book. Margaret, why did you write your book?
So I moved, it took me a while to move out to California. After graduation, I spent time in Washington, and then I went to grad school in Philly. And then in the spring of 2000, I think about 2 weeks before the peak of the NASDAQ during the dot-com boom, my husband Jeff and I moved out to San Francisco. And it was I was in the middle of this gold rush. I was writing a dissertation in histories and wondering what I was doing, and then my husband was trying to get some of the gold rush. And it was just this mysterious world that I didn't know anything about. I was a computer user. I had email. I had my flip phone. But it was I really wanted to read and understand and learn about the history of the place and the industry that I'd come to, and I couldn't find anything that was really written for someone like me who was not a technical person, who was not in the industry. And I found a lot of mostly hero narratives, not as much techlash then, but you know, books about companies, books about individuals, but nothing about the ecosystem. And so that was in 2000. And in the meantime, I wrote a book about the Cold War origins of Silicon Valley. That my dissertation became my first book. And then I kept on waiting for someone to write that Silicon Valley book. And I wrote another book about something entirely different. And I kept on waiting for someone to write that Silicon Valley book. And then I was like, well, I'm going to write another book. And I tried about 1,500 different ideas. And then I realized, you know what? I got to stop waiting for the person to write the book. I'm going to write the book. And I want to write the book. And I set on writing this book and really in earnest in 2014, and that was right at the beginning where
skepticism was growing.
It was growing. I believe the HBO show Silicon Valley premiered maybe that year or the next year, you know, and so that sort of that we're making the world a better place became like, really? But it still was, and I got a lot of headwinds when I first started interviewing people. I sort of moved down to the Bay Area on sabbatical, and I started talking to people who'd been at tech companies and been in the Valley for a long time, and I wanted to talk about politics and the role of, you know, how Silicon Valley fit into the rest of American history. And I got so much pushback. You know, someone said, oh, can I just tell you something? I think this book is going to end up on the remainder table because there's no interaction between government and Silicon Valley.
Which is totally wrong.
Which is totally wrong. So it's been an incredible journey. By the time the code came out, someone said, oh, did you time the release for this, particular hearing when CEOs were on Capitol Hill? I was like, no, that is not the release.
It came out?
Well, it came out in the summer for the hardback came out in July of 2019. And that was, one of the early, hearings were starting, and the mood was really different.
Yeah.
And part of it is, it's so big. It's so big.
Yeah.
I mean, what was the Valley like when you? I mean, how did you see the industry evolve in the time that you worked in it?
Yeah, I think that's a key point of why there is sort of a techlash, is that, super deeply ingrained in the DNA of Silicon Valley is this disruptor mindset. Like, we are the new thing that's going to disrupt the old thing. We're HP disrupting IBM. We're Facebook disrupting Microsoft. We're whatever. And, next thing you know, those were the only companies left standing. Like, the old guard companies don't exist anymore for the most part. And what we're left with is FANG, now Mang, the Meta, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google, right, are considered sort of the big five. And, I feel like a rock star on stage.
Disco balls.
Hello, Cleveland. Sorry, I just break the ice a little bit. What was that? I missed it. Somebody will fill me in later. No, but and I think that is the pause moment where people sort of realize, like, wow, these companies not only are effectively monopolies in their respective categories, but are, you know, arguably more powerful than governments. Many governments around the world, certainly, arguably rivaling the U.S. government, you know. And so I think when private companies, anytime in U.S. history private companies have reached that stage, it's sort of a oh shit moment for everybody, right? Like, I just did a little piece on Nob Hill, you know, the railroad barons, Leland Stanford among them.
Yeah.
You know, that was a moment where everybody kind of went, well, wait a minute, we don't know that, you know, we're not seeing the spoils of this massive boom being distributed very evenly.
Yeah. I mean, you know, it's interesting because if you think of tech as, you know, new and forward thinking and so many things that are different. And look, the industry grew. Where did the money come from? The original venture capital funds came from old money. You know, the very first high tech VCs in the Valley were. They were using the Rockefellers and Whitneys and old money, Gilded Age fortunes were bankrolling those early funds. And so, you know, there are so many parallels. History doesn't repeat itself, but there are patterns. And part of what we're seeing with the current mood is it's a life cycle thing.
Yeah.
You can't be the David when you truly are a Goliath.
Right.
And but I think one of the real challenges, and I know we have some attorneys in the room, is that the laws and regulations that govern our online economy, you know, social media platforms and others, were forged basically, you know, back in the 90s, not too long after we graduated from Northwestern, when you were in business school and I was in DC, and at a time when, you know, why does Section 230, which is the law that essentially holds platforms harmless for what third parties put on them, whether it be violence or revenge porn or anything. It was in response to, remember CompuServe and Prodigy? That's what it was responding to. Those were the platform services then. And it was creating a really broad runway. I mean, lawmakers of both parties in the 90s, and this made sense in the mid-90s. The internet was a lot smaller, remember? You know, let's give these small companies a lot of room to grow. The internet industry was saying, don't regulate us, let us regulate ourselves. Don't, you know, make sure that the big telecoms and the Goliaths of that era don't squash us. Yep. And it worked brilliantly, brilliantly. And now what we're trying to do, just like with the antitrust laws of the turn of the 20th century, is post hoc figure out, okay, what do you do when this bigness becomes too much, when it is hurting consumer choice, when it's hurting public discourse, and how do you harness the positive things about this technological revolution, because there are a lot of positive things. I am wearing a supercomputer on my wrist. Cool. And more computing power than an Apollo rocket, Apollo guidance system, sending people to the moon, less computing power than this. So that's really, really cool. But we've had a lot of downstream effects. And what I love about your book, Mike, is how you're using fiction and a really kind of a thriller of a story, a page turner of a story, to get into these issues that sometimes can seem kind of, you know, well, yeah, some of it's be dry if you don't put a human face on it and make it real.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly, I described the book as a cultural critique of the tech industry disguised as a corporate thriller. So I realized, like, this can't just be sort of my opinions and preachy and whatever else. I very much wanted, after, you know, a career in tech, to sort of reflect on some of those negative impacts. But you know, I had to have a story for it, right? And so, because it is fiction after all. The approach too that I took was to tell the story of sort of this cautionary tale through one man's journey, one family's journey, really. You know, Sam Hughes, the protagonist in the book, is from Ohio, not Wisconsin. And part of the reason for that is that, you know, I looked at Midwestern states. I'm from Wisconsin, my dad's from Michigan, my mom's from Minnesota, went to school in Illinois, many of my relatives live in Iowa. I like process of elimination. It was like, I guess it's Ohio. That he's going to be from. So, and then my son ended up going to college in Ohio, and I forgot that my entire wife's family is from Cincinnati, so I had connections there too. But I really liked that story of transplant, right? Silicon Valley is comprised of transplants, whether they're from Ohio or from India. And the amazing thing about that, the amazing culture that creates, is like people really want to be there. They self-selected to be in Silicon Valley to pursue this career in tech. You know, they had that ambition, that drive, that passion, etc. But with Sam, that kind of gets carried to an extreme, right? And you sort of see what the consequences are for him professionally and personally to that unbridled ambition that he ultimately pursues. And I felt that in my career in Silicon Valley. I think a lot of people in Silicon Valley, a lot of professionals in general feel this, where because of the stories that are told about the Elon Musks and the Mark Zuckerbergs and Steve Jobses, you sort of start to get this mindset that, gosh, if I'm doing startups and I don't have a multi-billion-dollar exit for my startup, like I must be a failure, right? Like that I didn't live up to my own 1 in a billion chance of success. And I see that, especially with younger people. I did a talk at Haas, at business school, and our talk at Northwestern had a lot of people who asked these questions too, who are current students. And you can see that and kind of hear that in their assumptions. Like they, rightly so, like expect to be not just successful, not just independently wealthy, but like fantastically, ridiculously off the charts, stratospherically wealthy, right? And you're like, that's not realistic. And if you're coming into your career with those kinds of expectations, you know, chances are you're going to be disappointed. So what Sam, you know, what makes Sam's story, I think, interesting, though, is he sort of thinks, he kind of goes into a midlife crisis, gets fired from his job, and then he gets this tantalizing little text message by mistake that leads him to think that there might be fraud going on within his company. And that little tidbit gives him a thread to pull on to kind of, you know, in some ways sort of do this laudable fiduciary responsibility thing, but in other ways really just exact revenge for, you know, his firing and to kind of try and achieve those personal ambitions that he has. So that's the message of the book. And, you know, again, it was a message and a story I wanted to tell about Silicon Valley more broadly. So yeah. I feel like I should have a good question for you lined up in my head, but I just like.
Well, why don't we open it up for?
Yeah, we could and we should. It's getting close to.
For people that will chat with Q&A for like 15 minutes.
Yeah, can I just say one thing too? I mean, we're in the children's section, so I probably shouldn't swear, but I'm fucking just awe-inspired by this group of people. I look through the audience to see so many friendly and familiar faces. It's just really incredible. So thank you both, or thank you all.
Yes, and we all look 22.
We do.
Metaverse,
baby. Haven't aged a day.
No matter the year. Yes.
So yeah, I can tell there's a really shy crew.
Yeah.
Maybe somebody could venture out a question.
I see a question.
Uh-oh.
Yes.
Uh-oh.
Speak up.
So you both have kind of lived it, right? And then we're back here for reunion.
Yeah.
So what kind of, and speaking this, right? So, you know, you're thinking about lots of different things about your own lives. What's been the biggest thing for you, like, in terms of you've lived the journey and you didn't think it would ever be like this in terms of your own experience?
Well, I mean, anyway, yeah. So this is going to sound off topic, but I'll bring it back, trust me. So the title bit flip is a bit in binary code when it goes from 0 to 1 or 1 to 0 is called a bit flip. And so I'm using it metaphorically in the title to refer to sort of this change of heart that the character goes through. But I was going through a similar change of heart, right? Like I had been in the tech industry for a long time, was kind of struggling with some of those thoughts I just outlined. The character struggles with Sam. And, I think frankly, COVID brought that out for a lot of us. I also think we're all, many of us are at our 30th reunion here, so we're sort of at a juncture in life where you do start to reflect a little bit on, you're so head down for the early part of your, you get out of college and you get into your career and you get married and you have kids and you're on like a roller coaster. And, as our kids get into college themselves, many of you already have kids in college yourselves or out of college, you start to go, well, what's next? Like, is this something that is really satisfying for me? So that was it for me, to answer your question, is really what, I sort of expected I'd be in tech my whole career, and I'm not. I'm in my second career now. I use career in quotation marks because I haven't earned any money off of that. But in concept.
In the vocation. Well, I'll just add to it. I mean, I've never worked in tech, but I had a funny, strange experience as I started my career in government in Washington, D.C., and I worked in the Clinton administration, and for a while worked for Al Gore, who was Mr. Information Superhighway. I did not work on tech policy in any way, shape, or form. I worked on something completely different. And it was so strange when I was researching the code. It's very weird. I'm a historian. I like dead people. I mean, people
Do you
can't
see them too?
I see them. Yes, I do. But it is very intimidating to be writing about a world, and even if you're not only writing about prominent people who are still alive, but also writing to an audience of readers who might have worked in the industry, right, or continue to have lived that history. And so it's strange. And I remember when I was going to there's a section in my book, I talk about the 90s a lot, and I talk about the Clinton administration, and I was in the Clinton library looking at memoranda meetings, and there was one of a meeting of Gore had this Gore Tech group of Silicon Valley people that would come, venture capitalists and entrepreneurs, and they would come to the White House, and I'm reading this thing, and I'm like, holy cow. I remember sitting at my desk, looking out into the hallway of the executive office building and seeing all these guys in their khakis and their blue shirts. And I'm like, oh, the Silicon Valley people are here. And not really, it was a humbling reminder of one, human memory is fallible and selective, but two, when we're in it, we don't fully appreciate the history that's being made. We can't really, it isn't legible to us. You need time to have the dust settle and to, see what the patterns are so you can recognize them. And I think one of the real challenges about the information overload that we're operating in, we're just all drinking from this fire hose of information. Good information, bad information, but just too much information, right? When we were in college, we had the Daily Northwestern, maybe the Chicago Tribune if you're fancy and read a newspaper, maybe the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times if you're really fancy.
And an econ major.
And we had our network news, right? We would sit in the common room of the dorm or the fraternity house, the sorority house, and watch.
No phones, no email.
No, and it was, first of all, shared experience, collective experience, and also just there's only so much information. And that, I think, is one of the great challenges of right now, and thinking about an American historian who, I write about politics, I teach about politics, I teach about business, and now we're just inundated with all this stuff that it is very hard, our neurons cannot keep up. No. And it's very easy to get jaded and cynical and turn off and be like, I cannot deal with any more news, stop the news. Don't tell me or there's no point in me voting or signing a petition or writing a book or doing whatever I do to make change because it's all too much. And that's, I think, a kind of the bigger existential challenge that the techlash is operating within. Obviously, the platforms have been part of it, and they've exacerbated it. And Mike, to your point, like the way that these companies grow and be successful, there's a very particular model, right, which is it is move fast and break things. That wasn't invented by Mark Zuckerberg or Facebook. That was invented by semiconductor executives in the 1960s, because that's how you built microchips. That's how you won. You had to move really fast and iterate and be super aggressive and growth. And now when that ethos of business is being applied to a realm that's quite different, but also incredibly lucrative. So much money. I mean, it's not going equally to everyone. That's a real, that's where the problem lies.
Yeah. Agreed. Another question?
So what's the solution?
Next book. That's what the solution is.
No, Mike's next novel will have a solution to the techlash.
Candidly, have you thought about that as
yeah.
a historian?
Yes.
Okay, here's where we are, and you're talking about laws that are outdated. I'm sure that congressional folks maybe tap into you and ask for, how do we do this? It's not trust busting, because really what we are is so individualized that it's overwhelming everyone. So have you given that thought?
I have. I mean,
Can you tell it?
I think it's instructive to look back actually to the early 20th century. Again, not a perfect analogy. And one interesting thing the US has done, it really less often breaks up companies and more often regulates them. Like, stay big, but we're gonna regulate you in some way. But if we look at these agencies that now are the regulators of tech, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, for example, that was created in 1913, 1914. That's the product of that earlier era.
Right.
And so we do have, there's a legal framework, and part of it is a matter of enforcement, and part of it is a matter of updating it. But in a more kind of macro sense, I think that there are two things that would fix it, but they go against, I think what makes them so sticky is they go against the things that kind of certainly make Silicon Valley or the tech industry go, which is slowing down the speed, going slow, like the slow food movement in a way, but applying that to tech, which is, again, if you're in business, all the people who are in business, particularly publicly traded companies, are like, yeah, that's gonna work. Like, that's again, but going more slowly, growing more slowly, and then going smaller. So part of the problem with, if you just, again, social media platforms is simply scale. When you cannot moderate a platform at the scale of Facebook or Instagram or even Twitter. It's a whack-a-mole. You
can't even keep Mike from cursing in the children's.
Exactly. This is out of control. So you can't, there's just bigness is part of the problem. I'm not giving you your neat solution, but these principles are important.
I would say, well, first of all, I'll start by saying, I think there's a recognizable pattern throughout US history where, especially in the US, the way we've funded development is we give stuff away. We give land away so you can mine on it, you can build your railroads, we give bandwidth away, we lay the ground, the federal government, we the people, lay the groundwork for private individuals to make the investment. That's great, develops new industries, leads to our prosperity, it's all good. Problem comes in the later part of that, when the mines are, stripped clean, the monopolies exist, etc. And so I think there's a very natural cycle, and we're getting into it in tech, where there's been this success of this investment over the last 20, 30 years, and it's now time for the next stage, which is regulation. I think to answer your question, I'd say, I'll give you three quick ones. One, Leslie works in the medical device industry, highly regulated. I wouldn't want to see tech regulated that much, but I don't see any reason why an equivalent of clinical trials couldn't be submitted to a regulatory body for testing on Instagram and other things that affect millions and millions and millions of kids in particular. So that's one. Another we were talking about in the green room is Communication Decency Act, CDA. There's a section 230 that gives liability cover, like no liability for social media platforms to allow misinformation, disinformation, harmful content to be propagated on their platforms. That should be taken away or changed so that there can be a threat of legal action and liability to the platforms. And I have a third, but I can't think of it. Another question. Let's go. Let's do power. We're supposed to adjourn pretty darn close to 6, so fire away.
I do research on how third-tier wage country outsourcing is destroying the middle class in this country.
In this country.
Many of those large tech companies are some of the biggest offenders. Did you run across any interesting stories about those things that you wanted to?
Yeah. First of all, outsourcing, outsourcing the tech manufacturing, tech companies were the earliest movers. So starting in the early 60s, you have microchip companies, California, moving labor to East Asia. And in part because looking for lower labor costs, but also skilled labor, and also because microchips are really light and fast and easy to ship across oceans at a time before containerization. And you know, the American tech industry has been a global supply chain for a long time, and it also, you know, one of the secrets of the American tech industry, of course, also is immigrants from elsewhere, right? People coming to the United States to come to school, to work in companies, to start companies, whether they're rank and file engineers or they're founders. And there's been a disproportionate number of foreign-born people. You know, but there has been, it isn't as though, you know, the interesting thing about these tech jobs is it wasn't as though they were similar to steel or some of the old line industries that were unionized jobs that were automated or went away. These were jobs, quite frankly, that when they were in the United States, first of all, Silicon Valley was full of assembly lines in the in the 60s and the 70s. They were, the majority of the people working on the lines were female. There were a lot of non-white, Asian, Latina workers, partially because they didn't have to be paid as much and they weren't unionized. So it's a slightly different story of job loss and automation in terms of secure, well-paying jobs going somewhere else. But it has created what we're dealing with now, particularly the chip industry and other very high-value, critical production chains, it's happening outside the United States. So something that used to be a US-based industry, and we saw this in the last 18 months with the chip shortage, and it's like, oh, everything is being made in Taiwan. Everything of this kind is being made in Taiwan, and everything of this kind is being made in Amsterdam. And what do we, how do we repatriate? So what's really interesting now is just in the last year how the CHIPS Act, which is putting money into domestic semiconductor production, which is going to take a while, but that is more money. To your point, Mike, about the U.S. government kind of putting its thumb on the scale of certain types of economic growth. That is money of a scale that hasn't been seen for a while, and that is how the needle moves in terms of certainly encouraging new technologies and advanced technologies where the market returns aren't immediate and it doesn't make sense for a company to make those sorts of upfront investments without some kind of subsidy.
I'm not smart enough to comment on your No, I don't mean to be flip, but I will. Yeah, next question. I have thoughts on it, but I'm not gonna drag. I'll give you thoughts on it. Choice. Yeah.
So, with your experiences writing about the Valley, has that opened both of you up to? Has the Valley opened itself up to you more, or is it closed off with some critique? And what does that look like for your future writings?
Is this directed to either of us?
Either, yeah, both.
Well, it's funny, in the events I've done in the Bay Area, which have been numerous, that's one of the biggest questions I get. It's sort of voiced expressed in the sentiment of, is this book about people you really know? Like, who's in this book? The sordid details. And yes, in some ways, the book is definitely derived from my real experiences. I, often credit Leslie with telling me, I'd share stories as I'd get home from work and just like funny things that happened during my day, and she'd say, you should write a book, it's funny. So a lot of the humor in the book is kind of derived from real things I saw, but I really realized early on that I wasn't trying to write like a tell-all memoir, and that if I did, it'd be boring. I never really experienced fraud or any of these kind of crazy things in my real life, in my real career. And so I really ended up fictionalizing the book substantially, and even though there are bits and pieces of real people, all the characters ended up being very much composite characters. So for me, there hasn't been any fallout, because as a fiction writer, I can always hide behind the disclaimer in the front of the book that, does not represent actual people. So that's for me, but.
I don't have that disclaimer.
No,
Yeah.
unless they're dead.
And I was, but then they have, you know,
Yeah,
family
yeah,
or like,
exactly.
who did what. I was really, really scared of that when I was writing. It was very, very unnerving, and I had to keep myself from kind of self-editing and not being unwilling to say things that were true, because I was worried about how the people reading them. I have been pleasantly surprised by how much people in the industry have been interested in it, have opened themselves to, have read the book, have enjoyed the book, have given me positive feedback, and have learned from the book, because it's so, you know, it's a pretty big sweep of history, and so it isn't, I start in the 40s and I end with basically the day before I turned in the manuscript in 2018 is the sort of last set of interviews I did. And so, you know, not everyone knows every piece of that. So everyone learns something about the industry if they've worked in the industry. And I think the other thing that I really, really tried to be very fair and not be a heroes or villains, not be a cheerleader, rah, 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 this place is amazing, or a, they are terrible, and they're behind the curtain and they are making you, you know, because I don't buy that, actually. I see, rightly or I see kind of a runaway train. They're like, wow, this was more successful than we imagined, and we don't know how to slow it down, you know, and there is, which is also alarming in its own way, so to be clear. But I think because I was really trying to play it down the middle, it kept people from feeling defensive when I was calling out where the shortcomings were. And I was one of the big things I was trying to reveal was this real intertwining of public and private, that the entrepreneurial success story of the Valley is also one of an American public, of an American political economy, American government and politicians of both parties kind of helping the industry grow in a way that has been true since Hamilton and Jefferson.
Yeah.
This is the way we roll, folks.
Yeah.
Like, these things are very, very intertwined.
It didn't happen here by mistake, and
Yeah.
it happened in the U.S. for a reason.
It is such an American story. It's an American story only in America where would you have like all these people, all this energy. So I think we're going to close out the program and turn to books. Thank you so much
That you all have time to buy the book and get it signed.
And have a beer or wine. I don't want
And
to bring
have a
those back to
beer
my
or
hotel.
wine. Thank you so much, Mike and Margaret.
That was awesome.